In 1841, on the French island of Bourbon, a 12-year-old enslaved boy reached into a pale vanilla flower and performed a movement that would change global taste. The flower had opened that morning. By evening, its chance to become fruit would be gone. Edmond pressed aside a tiny membrane, brought pollen into contact with the female part of the blossom, and closed with his thumb the gap that nature had kept apart. Months later, a green pod began to form. European botanists and colonial planters had spent years trying to make this Mexican orchid produce fruit far from its homeland. The vines climbed, the leaves thickened, and the flowers appeared, but the valuable pods did not. Then an enslaved child found a method simple enough to repeat across entire plantations. His technique helped turn a local American orchid into a crop of the Indian Ocean, a colonial commodity, an industrial flavor, and eventually something so common that its name became another word for ordinary. That is the first paradox of vanilla. Almost nothing about natural vanilla is ordinary. It comes from the fruit of a climbing orchid. Each commercially grown flower usually has to be pollinated by hand during the brief hours when it is open. The green fruit carries little of the aroma people recognize. That flavor must be released through months of careful curing. Yet today vanilla sits quietly inside ice cream, cakes, chocolate, perfume, soft drinks, medicines, and thousands of processed products, often without a single vanilla pod being involved. The second paradox is darker. The boy whose hand unlocked the crop never controlled the industry that followed. Planters, exporters, manufacturers, and flavor companies built wealth around a method Edmond Albius demonstrated, while he received no lasting reward and died in poverty. The history of vanilla is therefore not only a journey of taste, it is a story about who possesses knowledge, who receives credit, who performs invisible labor, and how chemistry can make a luxury seem plain. If you like stories where ordinary food turns into empire, trade, obsession, and hidden history, subscribe to Food Empire History. Now, to understand how vanilla became this powerful, we have to go back to where the story really begins. Long before vanilla climbed plantation supports in Madagascar, its ancestors climbed living trees in the warm forests of Mesoamerica. Vanilla planifolia is not a bean plant and not a tree. It is a tropical orchid vine, rooting in soil and bark, reaching through filtered light, and producing fleshy green capsules filled with countless tiny seeds. The familiar dark stick in a glass jar is the cured fruit of that orchid, commonly called a bean because of its shape. Wild vanilla belongs to an intricate forest world. The vine needs warmth, moisture, shade, support, and enough disturbance to find light without being exposed to punishing sun. Its flowers are built around separation. A small structure called the rostellum stands between the pollen and the receptive surface. The same flower contains both reproductive parts, but the barrier makes self-pollination difficult. That barrier would one day shape empires because a vanilla vine can travel more easily than the ecological relationships that once surrounded it. The exact beginning of human vanilla use is not securely documented. The Totonac people of the Gulf Coast of Mexico are most closely associated with its cultivation, especially around Papantla in Veracruz, but later traditions and modern retellings often sound more precise than the surviving evidence allows. Other Mesoamerican peoples, including Maya communities, may also have used vanilla before Europeans arrived. What can be said safely is that indigenous knowledge transformed a difficult forest orchid into a valued cultural and agricultural product. That transformation required more than finding a fragrant plant. Fresh vanilla fruit does not smell like a bottle of extract. Inside the green capsule, much of its future aroma remains chemically bound. Harvesters must judge maturity, stop the fruit's development, encourage enzymatic change, remove moisture slowly, and protect the pod from rot. Through killing, sweating, drying, and conditioning, the green capsule darkens, shrivels, and begins to release vanillin alongside hundreds of other aromatic compounds. This was the first great human invention in vanilla history, not a machine, but a sequence. Heat, moisture, sunlight, shade, time, and touch turned a nearly scentless fruit into stored fragrance. A badly handled pod could split, mold, dry too quickly, or lose much of its value. A well-cured pod became flexible, dark, concentrated, and durable enough to travel. Vanilla's power did not come from the orchid alone, it came from people learning how to finish what the plant had started. In Totonacapan, vanilla became tied to place, identity, exchange, and memory. It could be gathered from forest growth and later managed within cultivated landscapes where vines climbed trees among other crops. It was used as fragrance, flavor, and a valued substance in local life. A later Totonac legend tells of a forbidden love whose blood gave rise to the orchid. The story is culturally important, but it is a legend, not a dated record of domestication. The Nahua name often recorded for vanilla, Tlilxochitl, refers to the darkened fruit rather than the pale flower. That distinction captures the ingredient's central transformation. The orchid blossoms briefly, but the object of value appears only after the fruit has been harvested and changed. Vanilla was never simply picked and eaten. It was made, and the knowledge of making it belonged to communities that understood the forest, the vine, the timing, and the cure. By the late pre-Hispanic period, vanilla moved through the political and trading networks of central Mexico. The Mexica, commonly called the Aztecs, received goods from conquered and tributary regions, including the Gulf Coast. Vanilla was associated with cacao drinks, especially in elite settings where cacao itself carried wealth and status. The combination was not the sugary hot chocolate of modern cafes. It belonged to a world of ground cacao, water, foam, spices, ceremony, and hierarchy. Vanilla's role in those drinks was important, but it should not be exaggerated. It did not create the Aztec state, and it was not the single treasure for which armies marched. It was one valued product inside a much larger tribute economy. Its significance came from scarcity and control. The orchid grew in humid lowlands, while imperial consumers lived in the highland capital. To taste vanilla, there was to taste distance, specialized knowledge, and the reach of political power. Spanish conquest broke that political order, but preserved the appetite for many of its luxuries. Cacao, vanilla, cochineal, tobacco, and other American products entered European networks through violence, translation, experimentation, and trade. Hernán Cortés is often credited with introducing vanilla to Europe, but history rarely turns on one delivery by one man. Spanish colonization created the routes through which both cacao and vanilla crossed the Atlantic, while indigenous cultivation and processing remained the foundation beneath the new commerce. In Europe, vanilla first traveled largely in the shadow of chocolate. The two ingredients had already been joined in Mesoamerica, and European consumers continued the pairing while adding sugar, milk, and their own expectations of sweetness. A later story says Hugh Morgan, apothecary to Queen Elizabeth I, presented vanilla as a flavor in its own right around 1600. The detail is often repeated, though the surviving evidence is thinner than the confidence of the legend. What is clear is that vanilla moved into elite kitchens, pharmacies, and perfumeries. It was praised as a stimulant, a medicine, an aphrodisiac, and a luxury aroma. Some claims reflected genuine sensory effects. Others reflected the early modern habit of giving rare imports almost miraculous powers. Vanilla-flavored chocolate, custards, creams, and eventually frozen desserts, but the price and limited supply kept it far from ordinary households. In the 18th century, French cooks strengthened vanilla's association with sweet cream and ice. In the young United States, Thomas Jefferson copied a recipe for ice cream that called for a stick of vanilla. He did not introduce ice cream to America, as the popular myth claims, but his handwritten recipe shows how firmly vanilla had entered elite Atlantic dining. The orchid from Mexico was becoming the taste of refinement, but its production still depended on Mexico. That dependence frustrated European empires. Colonial powers were skilled at moving valuable plants. Sugarcane, coffee, tea, cloves, nutmeg, breadfruit, and rubber were all carried across oceans in attempts to redirect wealth. Vanilla vines were also transported into botanical gardens and tropical colonies. They could survive, they could climb, they could even flower. Yet outside their native environment, the flowers usually failed to produce pods. The obstacle was smaller than a fingernail. The rostellum kept the flower's pollen from reaching its stigma, and the effective pollinating relationships of Mesoamerica did not travel with every cutting. For planters, the result was maddening, a healthy vine with no saleable crop. Mexico retained a biological advantage that ships, gardens, and imperial ambition could not easily remove. Vanilla cuttings reached islands in the western Indian Ocean during the early 19th century. On Bourbon, now Réunion, the French hoped to create a new source for a spice that commanded high prices. The tropical climate could support the vine, but climate was not enough. Flowers opened and faded without fruit. Each empty blossom was a reminder that owning the plant did not mean owning the system that made it productive. In 1837, the Belgian botanist Charles Morin published a method of artificial pollination after studying the structure of vanilla flowers. His work demonstrated that humans could replace the missing pollinator, but the method was delicate and too cumbersome for profitable field use. Science had identified the door, but plantation agriculture still lacked a fast way to open it thousands of times. 4 years later, Edmond changed the equation. Born enslaved on Bourbon in 1829, he grew up around the plants of the Bellevue estate under the authority of Ferréol Bellier-Beaumont. Edmond learned by watching, handling, and experimenting. In 1841, he showed that a thin stick or blade of grass could lift the rostellum while a thumb pressed pollen into place. The motion was quick, teachable, and gentle enough not to destroy the flower. The brilliance of the method was not that nobody had ever imagined artificial pollination. Morin had already published his experiments. Edmond's achievement was practical scale. A worker could move from flower to flower during the narrow morning window, repeating the action before each blossom closed. The biological bottleneck that protected Mexican production had been converted into a daily labor task. Planters came to see the technique. Edmond was taken around the island to demonstrate it to other enslaved workers, who would perform the repeated hand labor on which the new industry depended. Vanilla production on Réunion rose dramatically during the following decades. The island exported about 2 metric tons in 1858, around 20 tons in 1867, and roughly 200 tons by the end of the century. The numbers reveal more than agricultural growth. They show knowledge being absorbed into a colonial machine. One child's insight became instructions, schedules, labor routines, curing houses, shipping contracts, and export revenue. The hand movement remained intimate, but the system around it grew enormous. Vanilla had crossed the line from transplanted curiosity to scalable commodity. Réunion growers also refined curing methods inspired by Mexican practice. Green pods were scalded to stop further development, kept warm to sweat, dried in alternating sun and shade, then conditioned for months until their aroma stabilized. This became associated with Bourbon vanilla, named for the island's former colonial name. Pollination created the fruit, but curing created the product that merchants could grade, store, insure, and sell. From Réunion, the crop and its techniques spread through French colonial networks to the Comoros and Madagascar. In the humid northeast of Madagascar, vanilla found conditions suited to intensive cultivation. French rule, commercial infrastructure, access to ports, and the transfer of hand pollination and curing knowledge helped move the center of production westward. By the early 20th century, Madagascar had overtaken Réunion and become the dominant source of natural vanilla. The industry had achieved what European planters wanted: freedom from Mexican supply. But the word freedom did not describe the people whose work made it possible. Edmond remained enslaved until the abolition of slavery in the French colonies in 1848. He was given the surname Albius, yet no share of the expanding trade. Attempts to secure him a pension failed. He died in 1880, poor and largely unrecognized. Even his authorship was challenged. A French botanist, Jean-Michel Claude Richard, claimed that Edmond had learned the method from him. The dispute was shaped by a society reluctant to credit scientific insight to an uneducated black child born into slavery. Later, historical work restored Edmond's place, but recognition arrived long after the profits. Vanilla remembered his gesture every morning, while the industry forgot the person who created it. The same gesture still structures natural vanilla production. A flower opens for a short period, and a worker must identify it, reach inside, lift the barrier, and press the reproductive parts together. Too early, too late, too rough, or too slow, and there will be no marketable fruit. The pod then needs many months to mature. After harvest, curing can continue for weeks or months. Natural vanilla is therefore less a simple crop than a chain of deadlines held together by skilled hands. That labor is distributed across tens of thousands of small farms, especially in Madagascar's Sava region. Families tend vines under shade, inspect flowers, pollinate them one by one, guard green pods, judge maturity, and sell into a market famous for violent price swings. When prices are low, farmers may abandon vines because the work no longer pays. When prices rise sharply, theft, speculation, and premature harvesting can spread through producing communities. A cyclone can damage the supply. A buyer's reformulation can damage demand. A government price policy, a poor flowering season, plant disease, or panic among exporters can reshape incomes far from the supermarket shelf. The farmer carries much of this risk, even though the final product may appear inexpensive ice cream, luxury perfume, or branded chocolate sold thousands of miles away. High prices do not automatically mean secure lives. Pods can be stolen before harvest, encouraging farmers to pick early and sacrifice quality. Middlemen and exporters may capture a large share of the final value. Children may work beside adults because families face poverty, limited schooling, labor shortages, and urgent deadlines. Recent United States labor reporting continues to identify child labor in Madagascar's vanilla production, even as government reforms and international programs attempt to reduce it. This is not evidence that every vanilla bean was produced by a child, or that every supply chain is identical. It is evidence that the sweetness of natural vanilla can pass through regions where families have little protection from unstable markets. Traceability, cooperatives, direct purchasing, school access, and longer contracts can improve conditions. But a label that says natural does not by itself guarantee that the labor behind it was fairly rewarded. While colonial agriculture expanded the supply of vanilla pods, chemistry prepared a second revolution. In 1858, the French chemist Nicolas Théodore Goblet isolated vanillin, the molecule most strongly associated with vanilla's characteristic aroma. Natural vanilla was no longer only a spice. It was also a chemical puzzle that could be separated, named, measured, and eventually reproduced. In 1874, Ferdinand Tiemann and Wilhelm Haarmann developed a practical synthesis of vanillin from a compound found in coniferous plants. Haarmann established production in Holzminden, Germany, creating one of the earliest industrial flavor factories. For the first time, manufacturers could obtain the central note of vanilla without growing an orchid, pollinating a flower, waiting for a pod or curing it for months. The factory did not perfectly copy the bean. A cured vanilla pod contains a complex mixture of hundreds of compounds, while synthetic vanillin delivers a narrower and more direct signal. But that single molecule was powerful, recognizable, stable, and cheap. It could survive industrial recipes, standardized batches, and give consumers the same expected aroma again and again. Later processes made vanillin from clove-derived materials, wood pulp lignin, and eventually petrochemical feedstocks such as guaiacol. The flavor of a tropical orchid became separable from tropical agriculture. A paper mill's waste stream or a chemical plant could now compete with forests, farms, curing sheds, and months of human attention. This was vanilla's industrial transformation. Fragrance without fruit. Synthetic vanillin spread through baking powders, confectionery, ice cream, beverages, medicines, perfumes, and packaged foods. It also supported chocolate, where vanilla can soften bitterness and round other flavors without announcing itself. Because it was affordable, manufacturers used it not only as a featured taste, but as background architecture. Vanilla became one of the invisible ways industrial food learned to taste familiar. This abundance changed the word itself. Once a rare American spice, served in courts and elite dining rooms, vanilla became the default flavor, the neutral option, the safe choice. In everyday language, vanilla came to mean conventional or unimaginative. The transformation was so complete that people began describing one of the world's most labor-intensive spices as plain. Yet the cheap version did not eliminate the expensive one. Natural vanilla and synthetic vanillin now occupy overlapping markets. A premium ice cream may advertise visible seeds and named origin. A mass-produced cookie may use artificial vanillin. A chocolate bar may use natural extract in tiny quantities. A perfume may combine real vanilla materials with laboratory molecules. The modern flavor is not one supply chain but several, layered together behind similar words. Most natural vanilla still comes from Vanilla planifolia, often propagated through cuttings rather than seeds. Clonal multiplication helps growers preserve desirable traits, but it can narrow genetic diversity. Researchers have warned of genetic erosion in cultivated vanilla and damage to wild populations through habitat loss and extraction. A crop made globally scalable by copying vines and hand-pollinating flowers can also become biologically vulnerable through that very uniformity. Fungal disease, extreme weather, changing rainfall, cyclones, and temperature stress can threaten production. Madagascar remains the leading producer and exporter, and in many recent years, it has supplied a large share of the world's natural vanilla. Concentration makes the supply chain efficient, but it also means that a regional shock can travel rapidly into contracts, prices, recipes, and farmer incomes. Mexico, the homeland of Vanilla planifolia and the center of its deepest cultural history, now produces only a small share of the global crop. Farmers, scientists, and cultural advocates in Veracruz are working to protect native diversity and preserve Totonac knowledge. The geography of value has been reversed. The plant began in Mesoamerica. The practical global pollination method emerged on Réunion. The dominant crop moved to Madagascar, and much of the flavor now comes from factories. Open a bottle labeled pure vanilla extract, and the liquid represents years of biological and human work compressed into a few dark drops. A vine had to mature. A flower had to open, a hand had to close the gap inside it, a pod had to grow for months, then be killed, sweated, dried, conditioned, shipped, graded, chopped, and soaked, so alcohol could carry its aroma into the bottle. Open a packet labeled artificial vanilla, and a different history appears. Chemists learned to identify the molecule at the center of the aroma. Factories learned to manufacture it cheaply, and industrial food learned how to place that signal almost anywhere. One path begins with an orchid and thousands of human touches. The other begins with molecular structure and scalable chemistry. Both lead to a smell most people recognize instantly. That is why vanilla is not plain. It is a rare orchid disguised as an everyday flavor, indigenous knowledge carried into imperial trade, an enslaved child's discovery converted into plantation profit, Malagasy farm labor hidden inside luxury, and a natural fragrance rebuilt by industrial chemistry. Its entire history turns on the same narrow separation inside a flower, a barrier that nature created, humans learned to cross, and markets learned to monetize. The next time vanilla disappears into cream cake, chocolate, or coffee, notice how little of its history remains visible. The dark pod may be absent, the worker is absent, Edmond's thumb is absent, the forests of Mexico and the farms of Madagascar are absent. What remains is a familiar aroma, soft enough to feel ordinary and powerful enough to carry 5 centuries of trade. Vanilla became the world's default flavor because generations of people repeatedly did what the plant could not easily do alone. They moved it, pollinated it, cured it, studied it, copied it, synthesized it, and sold it. The result is not a blank taste, it is history made invisible by success. If this story changed the way you see vanilla, subscribe for more hidden food history.